Welcome to another monthly Big Picture episode of the Michael Yardney podcast, when I chat with Pete Wargent. Now, only a few months ago there was talk, in fact hope, of interest rates starting to fall by the middle of this year. In fact, Australia's biggest bank, the CBA, suggested there could be 6 cuts in interest rates over the next 2 years. And then things changed. Inflation remained more stubborn and the economy grew more strongly. And suddenly there was talk about potential interest rate rises. Well, what's ahead for interest rates in our property markets? Well, there are clues in the news as to what's ahead, and I'm going to discuss these in this month's podcast with leading financial commentator Pete Wargent, who brings decades of perspective to his views. And as always, we're going to be discussing a raft of macro and microeconomic factors that should give you some clues as to what's ahead for our economy and our housing markets. So, on with the show.
Welcome to the Michael Yardney podcast, where twice each week you will learn a number of new ideas regarding success, property investment and money in around 30 minutes. Our show is brought to you by Metropole, who specialise in helping you grow, protect and pass on your wealth through strategic property and wealth advice. Now here's your host, Michael Yardney, Australia's authority in wealth creation through property, who has been voted one of Australia's top 50 most influential thought leaders.
Pete, I always enjoy our Big Picture podcast chats. It was good catching up with you at Wealth Retreat, but since then you've been travelling a lot. Where are you now, Pete?
I'm in Europe now. I was actually in Western Australia for a week. I haven't been over to Perth for years for various reasons with travel restrictions and whatnot. But very interesting to see the cyclical economy over there in full swing. Yeah, I'm now in Europe and I'll be heading back to Australia eventually, but via the US. So doing a bit of a round-the-world trip this year.
Fantastic. Well, since our last chat, we've had a federal budget, and that's a bit of old news now. But there's lots of data that's been coming out that's changed many people's minds on what's ahead for interest rates. So I'd like to go through a couple of things. Well, let's start with the budget. Sure, it's old news, but there were some interesting things I think are still worth discussing, as they are likely going to affect the trajectory of our housing markets and interest rates. Jim Chalmers handed down that budget, but in my mind, a lot of it was set for an election year. I mean, the government really has got the challenge of supporting Australians who are dealing with this cost of living crisis, the increases that many Australians are suffering from, but it also had to remain mindful of not adding to inflationary pressures, Pete.
That was the balancing act, wasn't it? So I think the thing that really caught the headlines was that every household in the country gets $300 discount from their power bill. So no means testing, everybody gets it, plus small businesses will get $325. And it's worth remembering that's in addition to the state discounts that have already been handed out. Election year coming up, as you know. But Queensland, we get $1,000.
Really?
Victoria, I think it's $400 down there, and WA $400. So when you actually add all that up, well, our power bills in Queensland are going to be very cheap up north this year. As you said, the debate was really with these subsidies, plus there was also a 10% increase in the Commonwealth rent assistance. So what that does, it effectively mechanically reduces headline inflation by about 0.75 percentage point. So the government will be able to say roughly by around about Christmas that inflation is back to the 2 to 3% target. That's way ahead of what the Reserve Bank was forecasting. But of course, this is somewhat artificial.
It's what they call headline inflation rather than underlying inflation. Would that be a fair assessment?
Well, that's right. Yes, it doesn't actually reduce the inflation in services. And some people might say, well, you free up some money from power bills. It might actually free up some cash to be spent elsewhere. Lucy Ellis from Westpac made a couple of very good points, though. There's really 3 things that are in favour of what Chalmers has done with the subsidies. Firstly, because there is growing slack in the labour force, it might actually make sense for people to have the subsidies now rather than with the economy deteriorating over the next 3, 6, 12 months. I think the other thing is that a lot of other stuff in the economy is actually indexed to inflation. So you do get this kind of second order impact by reducing the headline figure. And then thirdly, and this is probably the most important point, is that if people feel like living costs aren't going up as much, well, that in itself kind of reduces inflation expectations for consumers. So yeah, I mean, look, we're in that disinflationary trend at the moment. Inflation's coming back down, has done in the UK, has done in Canada. Australia's just a bit further behind, and our inflation rate is about 3.5% or so, and it probably won't get down till 2 to 3% until the end of this year, and probably even next year for core inflation, as you said.
One of the reasons we're interested in this, of course, is we're wondering what that's going to do to interest rates, and the Reserve Bank's target of getting them close to 2 to 3%, inflation down to 2 to 3%, will then allow them to start considering dropping interest rates. But more recently also, unemployment rose just a little bit, and that's also going to be good for interest rates. And the latest jobless numbers and wage growth figures suggest well, the talk about rising rates that sort of crept up a few months ago, that seems to have gone now. And the latest statements from the Reserve Bank says they're going to need to see some significant changes, and changes that are going to be there for a while, not just short-term ones, before they make a difference to interest rates in either direction.
It's very, very interesting, isn't it? So the employment figures, bit of a dichotomy. In April, employment rose 38,500, which in any other time you'd say that's really good, but it's really all part-time jobs. And if you look over the past 3 months, employment's increased 151,000. So there's more people in work than ever before, about 14.3 million. But I think what we've seen from other parts of the world, if you look at, say, Canada, they've been, like Australia, running record high immigration, and they've got unemployment suddenly at 6.1%, just with a bullet. And I think there's a potential risk here for Australia. We've already seen unemployment go from 3.5% to now 4.1%. And clearly, if you look at the leading indicators or the forward-looking indicators, we're heading higher. I mean, in a sense, this is what the Reserve Bank's trying to achieve, to cool down the economy from the overheated period. I think in that context, a rise in unemployment isn't that unexpected. But I think if you look ahead, there is a potential risk there, and also wages growth probably slowing. And to circle back to your original point, well, yes, that there was some talk earlier in the year about interest rate hikes, but that seems to have gone away now. If you look at futures markets, if you look out to, let's say, September, October next year, well, implied yields are quite a lot lower than they are now. So we might not get any rate cuts anytime soon, but markets at least would be thinking that the next move is down, even if it takes until towards the end of the year or maybe early next year before that happens.
Well, just getting back to the unemployment figures, I think you've also got to look past that 4.1% figure in April. The participation rate is higher. In other words, more Australians are working, even though, as you said, one has to look at hours worked and how many are full-time jobs, part-time jobs. But considering how many more people have come to Australia, I would have assumed that unemployment may have risen a bit quicker than this. But we're still creating jobs, Pete.
Well, there's never been more people with a job in the country. I think some people actually have second jobs as well. There's always a bit of a debate about how well the unemployment rate is captured, and Roy Morgan Research has a different measure of unemployment, which tends to be higher. It's sometimes useful just to zoom out and look at the sort of bigger picture context. Before the pandemic, the unemployment rate was above 5%. And then, of course, during the lockdowns, it was off to the races and above 7%. So, yeah, it's off the lows and back up to just above 4%. But in the context of history in Australia, that's not particularly high. And at the moment, not an issue. But obviously, if it gets back towards 5%, then that becomes more of a concern.
Sure. Well, the other thing that goes hand in hand with this is wages, and they've increased recently. Annual wages growth was up 4.1% following the near record 4.2% over the December quarter. So at least wages are keeping up with inflation, and maybe even a little bit ahead of inflation, Pete.
Yeah, so they bounced around a bit. I think if you went back to the previous quarter, there was a big spike in public sector wages growth. There was a big sort of jump in award wages last year, but then in the March quarter, that came back down again. I think, interestingly, the private sector wages growth was only 0.8% in the March quarter. So the annual growth there seems to have peaked. And if you look around the country, well, Tasmania still has pretty strong wages growth at nearly 5%, but almost everywhere else it does seem to be coming back down again. So yeah, 4%, it's ahead of the rate of headline inflation at least. But I think there was a bit of a concern previously that with the labour shortages, we might end up with this almost in reverse of what you might read in a textbook, what they might call a price wages spiral. In other words, as inflation goes up, people demand higher wages and we get into this sort of upward spiral. Well, that's clearly, that risk is now past because wages growth is falling. It's really been tackled by very high population growth and immigration. So I think that risk's gone away. And again, this is probably feeds back into the interest rate picture. I don't think there's any risk of wages getting too far away now.
Well, that's good for interest rates and for us as investors or mortgage holders. Now, another point in the budget was the discussion about the housing crisis. Clearly, they couldn't get away without mentioning it, but many of the housing initiatives discussed were already framed in light of the government's. They already declared that goal of building 1.2 million homes over the next 5 years, which is a promise that most housing bodies acknowledge we're just not going to be able to meet. But in your daily blog, which I enjoy reading, you mentioned how one of the Reserve Bank commissioners spoke about some of the reasons why we've currently got a housing shortage, and it relates a lot to how many people living in each dwelling, Pete.
Yes, that's right. So yeah, you're right. The budget was surprisingly light on housing. There was a lot of talk about infrastructure in Western Sydney and Sunshine Coast Rail project, and actually there was a little bit of talk about student accommodation and the need to provide more rentals for international students. And if not, we'll have to cap the student numbers. Look, there were bits and pieces, and they also talked about fast-tracking visas for some skilled construction and trades workers. But all things considered, the budget didn't really do too much on housing. Certainly there was nothing unexpected. The Reserve Bank, Sarah Hunter, did a speech in Hobart last week. And yeah, so these days we only get 2.5 persons per dwelling. And obviously at a time when the population growth has been growing at above 2.5%, record highs, that's going to be a challenge, and that's at a time.
Got to compare to in the past, there were 2.8 people per household then. Now, that doesn't sound like a big change, but boy, does it translate to needing hundreds of thousands more dwellings just for the same number of people, Pete.
Well, that's right. If you multiply it out over, say, 11 million dwellings, it's a huge extra amount of demand. And this is coming at a time when construction insolvencies are at decade highs anyway. I think there's some other little nuances there that they did pick up in the speech. I think if you went back to 2019, there was about 31% of employed people were working from home some or all of the time. And yeah, it spiked up, of course, during the pandemic because of the lockdowns. But although it's come back down, it hasn't gone back to where it was. It's about 35% now. So that means people need more space, more people want home offices. Some people are going to be buying city crash pads, I imagine. So yeah, it's not just about the number of persons per dwelling. I think as well, people are replacing some of those city offices with actually offices in their home.
Yes.
I'm working from one right now and so are you. So yes. I guess that kind of actually speaks to that point. So yes, the supply and the demand is really out of whack. And I think the key takeaway from the speech is we've got an underlying demand for housing at around about, 300,000 needed, but we're actually completing about half that. So there's no way that the shortage is going to be tackled over the next year or two, and it's going to take quite some time before we get back into balance.
Well, there's two ways of looking at it. Unfortunately, in the short term, there's going to be a shortage of houses to buy and to rent, but that's also the supply and demand equation is going to mean that new properties are going to eventually have to be built, but we've spoken about it before, at a much higher cost. There's a lot of dependence by the government on medium and high density dwellings, but in the past they were supported by overseas investors buying properties here, overseas developers putting their money here to develop them, and they're just not financially viable to do on the one hand, and on the other hand, a lot of those overseas investors are no longer there.
Well, no, it's interesting, isn't it? A lot of talk about Victoria and land tax challenges at the moment, which some people are cheering on. But don't forget, we need investors to get those medium density projects out of the ground. So no wonder building approvals for units in Melbourne are at the lowest level in 15 years because we don't have the foreign buyers to buy them these days. They're kind of taxed out of the market. I think those figures that the RBA provided actually on new dwelling prices are very, very interesting. Basically tripled since the turn of the century, much faster increases than headline inflation. So you sort of look at some of the reasons for that. I think people expect a different level of quality these days. And I think things like energy ratings, so on. And then there's a whole range of issues with site clearance and decontamination, all these kind of things. But certainly since the pandemic, we've seen the cost of a new dwelling, it's up about 40%. And I would say for units, you guys would know because you've got a construction division, but it's probably more. It's very, very challenging with the price of materials. And I think another reason is just the wages that go into that component of building a new dwelling. The construction unions have got a lot of power in Australia and pushing for big wage gains again this year. So, yeah, the cost of a new house or new dwelling has actually gone up much faster than inflation over many decades, and particularly so over the past 4 or 5 years.
Well, it's not just the cost of materials, but the cost of labour, as you say. So in the budget, the government smartly said we're going to have to encourage more tradespeople. There was talk about increasing the trades by, I think, something like just over 20,000 people. That's really not going to tip the needle at all. And if they do go to TAFE and get it free or get it subsidised, Pete, it's going to be 2, 3, 4 years before they come out the other end anyway. So we just don't have enough tradespeople. And many of them are preferring to work in some of the more lucrative infrastructure projects. So it's hard to get those new houses out of the ground, and even more so the apartment buildings.
That's definitely been one of the challenges at the moment. I recounted on a different podcast how I saw an advert when I was at Noosa Civic the other day for lollipop workers earning, well, the best part of $250,000. You sometimes get these anomalies, but it does speak to that issue of FIFO workers. There's a real shortage of skills for people in construction, and a lot of them are going to infrastructure because there's some huge projects out there, Southeast Queensland, all across the state really, but not just there, other parts of the country too. There's not really much working in favour of residential construction at the moment. As the RBA pointed out, it will turn around eventually, but not at today's prices. Probably the interest rates are one factor that feed into that as well. I think the cost of money's gone up, so it's a bit more difficult to get these projects out of the ground.
Now, in my mind, the lollipop people were the ones at school crossings, and I'd not heard the expression until recently about the stop-start people, which I think are the ones you're talking about, at building sites or construction sites. And interestingly, I was speaking to Ross Elliott, an urban planner in Queensland, a couple of weeks ago, where he said when he was a kid, his parents threatened him that if he didn't get good grades at school, if he didn't go to university, he'd be a stop-start person on the street. And he said now they earn more than a lot of other people do. So you're right. It's an interesting way things are going. Now, Pete, I remember when we first got to know each other many, many years ago, and your first book came out, and I was impressed with it. And I asked you, can you write some blogs for us on property updates, some things from your first book? And then there was the second book and a third book and a fourth book. And boy, you've been very prolific. And your latest book has just come out, and that's book number 7. Is that correct?
I think it is. Yeah, I'll lose count myself now. But yes, keep an eye out for it. It will be actually released in the bookstores.
Well, it'll be out by the time people listen to this. So what's it called? And I know that you did it together with Kate Bakos, a good mutual friend. So what's your book called?
It's the Buy Right Approach to Property Investing, Mastering the Skills to Invest Wisely in Property. So the Buy Right Approach is the one to look out for. Blue book. You'll see it in the airport stores if you're flying around the country, or Dymocks or Amazon or wherever you buy your books. And Major Street is our publisher down in Melbourne. So if you want to order from them direct, you can as well.
Well, I'll leave a link in the show notes, Pete, but you've written so much, everyone else has too. What's new about it? What have you got there that would attract people? What message have you got?
We cover some of the fundamentals and the basics of investing in property, but we're particularly what Kate has done to bring this book to life. And as you know, she's been at the coalface of buying properties for 15 years or so. So there's a lot of real life case studies and examples in there. It's not just theory. We're using some real detail and texture in there to bring the book to life. So it's not just theoretical knowledge, it's how to put it all into practice. And it's things like how to do your due diligence on areas, how to research historical capital growth and performance, how to calculate return on your investment, and also just about how to adopt a cautiously optimistic outlook, because the world is changing, as we talk about so much on these big picture podcasts, but you need to take a long-term view and manage your risk. So yeah, it's been a great pleasure to co-author a book with Kate, and yeah, really excited to see it on the shelves.
Well, I'll leave a link in the show notes for people to find it. I guess Amazon's the easy way. You'll get it very quickly. Is it available on Kindle too? Because I don't think I've bought a physical book for a little while.
It's not yet, but it's on Amazon at the moment. So we'll get around to doing an audiobook at some point.
Oh, really? An audiobook too? Gee, I've actually thought about that and I just haven't had the time to do that. So interestingly, you made a comment about having a cautious approach, a risk-averse approach, but also an optimistic approach. Pete, I've never come across a rich pessimist. Unfortunately, there's a lot of them out there at the moment, and it's very easy to become pessimistic when you get the negative news, the uncertainty about the world, the challenges politically, geopolitically, climate change, what's going to happen to interest rates. But if we look at it, there's still a lot of really strong fundamentals to make us feel positive about property and Australia over the medium to long term.
There definitely is. I think if you think about things like artificial intelligence and changing technologies, nobody really knows what the future is going to bring. And that's even before you think about things like geopolitical issues. But I think given that people don't know the future, it does make sense to take an optimistic view if you're an investor, because otherwise, well, why are you an investor in the first place? But I think if you look back at the history of returns from stock markets and property markets in Australia, actually remarkably similar. If you go back over a century of figures, almost to within a couple of decimal points, you're getting the same return. And I think logically it does kind of make sense, because very often what you see when people have success in their career, or if they have success by building a business and selling it, often that wealth gets circled back into land prices and real estate and residential property. And the returns, they do dovetail a little bit over time, but yeah, very similar sort of returns over the decades. And I think that will most likely continue in a high population growth country like Australia, where people tend to circulate or circle around the capital cities, and also just a very wealthy country. We've got a lot of things going for Australia in terms of mineral wealth. We've got a strong open economic model. It's a very desirable place to go to. It's a popular part of the world to emigrate to as well.
Well, as we've said a few times, that big factors that are going to keep driving our property market are population growth, or to be blunt, family formation, which requires housing, but also the wealth of the nation. And we are becoming more a knowledge-based society. And I think we've got to be comfortable that Australia as a country makes its money in four ways. It digs things out of the ground and sells it, and people want those things. It grows things in the ground, and people are going to still want our foods, and we could be the food bowl of that growing Asian economy. Education, people are going to want to keep coming to our country, and yet both sides of Parliament, particularly Peter Dutton, has also been talking about cutting immigration education numbers. Doesn't make a lot of sense to me. That's really a short-term political move in my mind. And I guess the fourth thing is tourism. And a lot of the tourism and education are going to require people. So AI won't necessarily get rid of all that. So I think Australia's got a good long-term future. But the other point you made just briefly was the fact that we all want to go to the same 5 capital cities, and in fact the same 3 capital cities, different to other countries in the world. So there's a business plan for Australia to grow to 40 million people. That means for every dwelling we've got now, we've got to build another, or every 3 dwellings, we've got to build one more over the next 30, 40 years. Don't know how we're going to achieve that, but that's going to underpin our property values, Pete.
It does seem to be, and if you go back over the cycles, you can see the returns for yourself. It's not really opinion-based. That's just the way things have seemed to have gone. And I think as the capital cities get busier, some of that demand spills outwards a little bit. I think places like the Gold Coast and Sunshine Coast are picking up some of the demand, but yes, largely focused around Sydney, Melbourne and Brisbane. Yeah, there's been a lot of pressure on land prices they're building up, and also in Perth at the moment as well.
Oh, definitely. So over the years, what I've noticed is every decade or so, there's a major structural change. Something big happens, like the very low interest rates around COVID, like mining booms, the extra availability of finance in the 80s and 90s. I think the next big structural change that's going to push our housing markets is the transfer of wealth. The fact that over the next decade, baby boomers are going to slowly die off and transfer, well, it's been suggested up to $4.9 trillion to future generations. Well, in the next decade. Already that's happening with the Bank of Mum and Dad handing over some money now with a warm hand rather than a cold hand later. But this great wealth transfer to their children and their grandchildren who, well, their children are already going to be in their 50s in general, have paid off their home. What are they going to do with the money? In Australia, we tend to keep it in housing, and a lot of that wealth transfer is actually going to be houses, baby boomers' houses that have been paid off.
One of the key things I learned at Wealth Retreat was from Simon Kustenmacher from the Demographics Group, talking about the intergenerational wealth transfer. And this is not something that's just going to happen this year or next year. It's not going to actually peak if you look at the population pyramid until 2043. So this is something for the next 2 decades. And as you said, I think quite a lot of cases now we're seeing parents actually passing down that wealth early. They're thinking rather than waiting until I'm in a box and then the money going somewhere else, they're actually now helping their kids onto the housing ladder, trying to make use of those funds while they're still alive. And that's going to be an ongoing thing. I think if you look at Australia's wealth inequality and income inequality, historically it wasn't that big. Things like the superannuation system have really helped, and a high home ownership rate, but that's probably going to change, I guess. You talked about each decade seems to bring a structural change. Well, we've seen the fall in the average household size and, more separations, more single person households and things like that. I think you're right. The next decade or two is going to be characterized by what happens with all of that baby boomer wealth as it gets passed down to the next generation and to the next. And it could actually drive some inequality, and there'll be some challenges there, no doubt.
No doubt that's going to happen, and that's going to be a shame because some people are going to be able to inherit a house without a mortgage and others won't. And at the moment, it's happening in a different way. The Bank of Mum and Dad is able to help a group of people get into the property market and others can't. It's often been suggested if it was a real bank, the Bank of Mum and Dad would be one of the biggest lending institutions.
Yes, very interesting. And another similar and related trend I saw last week, there's PEXA reporting that in 2023, 29% of properties across Sydney, Melbourne and Brisbane, essentially the eastern states, were bought for cash. So with no mortgage at all. We hear a lot about mortgage stress, but almost a third of properties now being bought without a mortgage. And same trends playing out in other parts of the world. The USA, about a third of properties being bought for cash. So, yeah, again, I think this relates to that intergenerational wealth transfer. And obviously, that's going to become a key theme over the next couple of decades. So thanks so much for letting me on. I always enjoy our chats and look forward to chatting next time.
Well, thanks again, Pete. It's always fun chatting with you about these factors that are affecting our economy and our housing markets. And I guess if we can wait till 2030s, the housing markets are going to really boom when there's that significant wealth transfer. But in the meantime, there's also going to be lots of opportunities. See you soon. Well, lots of information from Pete Wargent, and I hope it's giving you confidence to know that despite all the challenges, there's lots of opportunities in our housing markets. Now, if you don't currently subscribe to this on either your podcast player or on YouTube where we play these audios as well, just stop for a second, subscribe so twice a week you get information from my guests and me. In a moment, I'm going to share my mindset message with you. But beforehand, I guess I'd like to just say, are you thinking about getting into the property market this year, either as an investor or a home buyer? if that's the case, you're probably like a lot of clients we see at Metropole, and you've got a number of questions you'd like answered. So why not go to metropole.com.au and organise an obligation-free chat with one of our wealth strategists and let them answer your questions. If you're stuck like many others are, or whether you're wondering, should you buy, should you sell, or should you just wait in the current markets, go to metropole.com.au and organise a chat to discuss your questions with a wealth strategist. By the way, we have no properties for sale, and so therefore we can give you independent advice. By the way, we also are much more than just a buyer's agent. We help our clients safely create intergenerational wealth through strategic property and wealth advice. And we're big enough to tip the scales in your favour, but still small enough to care. metropole.com.au.
Now here's Michael's mindset message. Remember, a change in your thinking will lead to a change in your life.
My mindset message today is about the P word. Today's inspiration is really a blog post from Gary Vaynerchuk, Gary V, who talked about the P word, which is patience. Gary V said that's the magic word, and that's going to unlock most of your problems. He said, I understand why patience is hard, because so many of you want to prove it. You want to prove yourself to your mum, your boyfriend, your girlfriend, your best friend, or to your boss. And he went on to say, the single best trait you can develop as an operator, an entrepreneur, a friend, a girlfriend, a wife, a daughter, a husband, a co-worker, or an employee is patience. Gary V said, there are very few concepts that I return to more than the idea of patience. 9 times out of 10, it's the answer to every question I get asked, he said. So many of you are wasting your days while worrying about your years. You're acting fast in the micro and deploying patience in the macro, said Gary V. It's also something most young people don't want to deploy. Patience must be your foundation, said Gary V. It's so hard, but it's worth it. You must believe that life is long. There are just way too many of you acting as if it ends tomorrow, and that if you don't get there right this second, then you never will. That if you don't get that promotion, that raise, that introduction, that car, that watch, the vacation, you never will. Trust me, said Gary V. That's not true. He said you have to understand that you've got so much time. Whether you're 14 or 44, patience is the answer, said Gary V. You have to play the long game, but move insanely fast each day. That's why I always joke about being a tortoise in a hare's costume. He said, my outlook is in 10, 20 or 30 years terms, but my execution is micro. It's all about making decisions. Micro speed, macro patience. Gary V said, if you know what you want, then you're good to go. Reverse engineer your goals and don't waver. Anything great takes time. Develop the work ethic, the mindset and the stamina to succeed, said Gary V. If you really understand what you want, then all you have to do is deploy patience. Too many say no before they say yes. Gary V said, if I told you that in 15 years you'd have a perfect life and all you had to do was work 15 hours a day, every day for the next 10 years, all of you would do it. The reason you don't do it is because you're uncertain as to where that work's going to lead. This is where you deploy patience, enjoy the process, and put in the work, was the message from Gary V. Now, interestingly, that fits in with a common theme that you've heard me talk about, and that theme is delayed gratification. If you do the easy things now, you're going to have a hard life later. But if you do the hard things now, you're going to have an easy life later. Well, thanks for spending the last little while with me, and I hope you got some benefit from this show. If you did, and you know somebody else who'd also benefit, please tell them about the Michael Yardney podcast. There's a share button on every podcast app. On Apple Podcasts, there's 3 little buttons down the bottom. Press it and share it, or just tell them about the Michael Yardney podcast. I hope you're going to be doing them a favour, and you'll definitely be doing me a favour and helping me in my quest to make as many people as possible financially literate. Now, there's ways of catching up with me between these shows. Just look for Michael Yardney on social media, or why not join my private Facebook group? Go to Facebook and look for the Property Update Facebook group. And I have a way of saying thank you to you for subscribing to this podcast. Go to podcastbonus.com.au. There'll be a link in the show notes, podcastbonus.com.au, where you can get a bunch of ebooks and reports. My way of saying thank you. And when you've got time, why not listen to some of the old podcasts? There's individual lessons in each of those that I think would be helpful for you. I'll be back again real soon. In the meantime, have a great week. Make it a great week.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Michael Yardney podcast, which was brought to you by Metropole, who help their clients grow, protect, and pass on their wealth through strategic property and wealth advice. If you like what you heard and don't already subscribe, you'll find us on iTunes or on your favourite Android app as the Michael Yardney Podcast. Watch out for our next show, which comes to you twice a week, and you'll learn some new ideas about property investment, success, and money in around 30 minutes. To get more of Michael's thoughts, go across to www.propertyupdate.com.au and sign up for his daily morning briefing, and you'll hear from not only Michael but a group of leading property success and money experts. And just a reminder that the information you heard in this show today is general educational advice and not specific investment advice, as we don't know your personal circumstances. If you're looking for specific advice, why not ask the team at Metropole to help you?